a cleaner who had been working diligently at Hartwell Industries for over 40 years, battles poverty to raise her grandchildren. When tyrant manager Richard humiliates her, young James witnesses her collapse, but fears exposing the abuse. Now a mysterious new CEO arrives. Will James break his silence, or let Hartwell's cruelty crush them all? Hey everyone, welcome to Worldly Whispers. Let's get started. Margaret Johnson, a 68-year-old janitor, has been a fixture at Hartwell Industries for over 4 decades. Every day, she pushes her cleaning cart along the long corridors of the company, her movements slow yet deliberate. She's been a silent contributor, maintaining the workplace's cleanliness, which is as essential as the heartbeat of the company. However, for most employees, Margaret is like a ghost. She only becomes visible when there's a mess to clean up. Margaret's mind often drifts to her grandchildren. The loss of her daughter 2 years ago has left her with a heavy burden. At an age when many are thinking about retirement, she has to work hard to support her 3 young grandchildren. Every ache in her joints and twinge in her back is a reminder of the responsibility she shoulders and the reason she can't afford to retire, despite her doctor's warnings. In this sea of indifference, James Anderson, a young accountant, stands out. He always takes the time to acknowledge Margaret. One morning, as Margaret makes her way towards the executive wing, James greets her with a warm, "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson." His friendly demeanor is a rare and welcome sight. Margaret, despite her weariness, responds with a warm voice, "Good morning, Mr. Anderson. How are you today?" They exchange a few pleasantries about their well-being and Margaret's grandchildren. Margaret's face briefly lights up when talking about her grandchildren, who are growing fast and keeping her on her toes. James sincerely tells her, "I'm sure they appreciate everything you do for them. You're an inspiration, Mrs. Johnson." Just as Margaret is about to respond, a sharp voice interrupts their conversation. Richard Blackwell, the department manager, storms towards them. Dressed in expensive shoes that click loudly against the floor, he sneers at James. "Anderson, don't you have work to do instead of wasting time with the help?" His cold eyes sweep over Margaret before focusing on James. James immediately straightens up, his friendly expression replaced by a professional mask. He quickly replies, "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. I was just heading to my desk." After James hurries away, Richard turns his attention to Margaret. "And you, make sure you actually clean properly today. I'm tired of seeing dust in the corners," he snaps. Margaret lowers her gaze, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I'll do my best." Richard scoffs at her response and walks away, leaving Margaret alone in the hallway. This kind of treatment from Richard is nothing new to Margaret. Over the years, as the company has changed, so has the atmosphere. When Margaret first started at Hartwell, it felt like a second home. Her colleagues were friendly, and management appreciated her dedication. But as the old guard retired and new faces took over, things shifted. Richard Blackwell represents all these negative changes. He has climbed the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency, stepping on anyone he deems beneath him. To Richard, Margaret is merely a nuisance, a relic of the past that he wishes would disappear. James, on the other hand, has been observing the situation between Margaret and Richard for months. Each time he sees Richard belittle Margaret, his stomach churns with a mix of anger and guilt. As a fresh graduate from college, James joined Hartwell Industries full of hope and ambition. However, he quickly learned that in this corporate environment, especially under Richard's management, it was safer to keep his head down. Richard's reputation for belittling employees, especially those from minority backgrounds, is well known throughout the office. Despite his growing discomfort with the situation, James has always been held back by the fear of losing his job and jeopardizing his fledgling career. Richard, meanwhile, in his corner office, surveys his domain with a smug smile. At 45, he believes he has achieved the pinnacle of success, which to him means having power over others. His insecurities, deeply rooted in a childhood of mediocrity, drive him to assert his dominance at every opportunity. When he spots Margaret through the glass walls of his office, cleaning the baseboards, a familiar spark of contempt ignites within him. He mutters to himself, "Time to remind the old bat of her place," as he gets up from his leather chair and heads towards the restrooms where Margaret is working. Little does he know that this particular encounter will set in motion a series of events that will change the course of the company. Margaret was engaged in her regular restroom cleaning, focused on removing a stubborn stain from the floor. The moment the door swung open, the sharp click of shoes announced Richard Blackwell's arrival. His presence alone filled her with dread. Richard immediately launched into a demeaning tirade. "Well, if it isn't our old-timer. Johnson, do you actually clean or just pretend?" he sneered. Margaret, rising slowly due to her aching joints, replied meekly, "I'm doing my best, Mr. Blackwell." But Richard was relentless. "Your best? This place looks worse than a filthy gas station," he scoffed, stepping closer, his cologne mixing sickeningly with the cleaning fumes. He continued to berate her, questioning her worth and ability. "You're past your prime, Johnson. The only reason you're here is no one else wants this menial job." Margaret, fighting back tears, tried to defend herself. "I've been with the company for 40 years, and I take pride in my work." Richard's mocking laugh echoed in the small space. "Pride in mopping? You're a relic, lucky to still have a job here." Unbeknownst to them, James Anderson had entered the restroom just before Richard. Startled by Richard's voice, he hid in a stall. Through the gap, he watched in horror as Richard verbally assaulted Margaret. The racial undertones in Richard's words were clear, and James felt a wave of nausea. He wanted to intervene, but was paralyzed by fear of losing his job and the potential consequences for his career and family. Margaret made one last attempt to stand up for herself. "I've always done my job well, Mr. Blackwell." Richard's response was vicious. "Your best isn't good enough. You're a disgrace to the company." With that, he stormed out. As soon as the door shut, Margaret crumpled to the floor, sobbing. James, filled with guilt, waited until she left before emerging. He stared at his reflection, ashamed of his inaction. In the following days, he noticed Margaret's increased timidity around Richard and her trembling hands. Determined to make amends, he began showing her small kindnesses. He greeted her warmly each morning and left coffee on her cart with kind notes. He also urged his colleagues to keep their areas clean for her sake. Some agreed, while others complained, but James persevered. Margaret noticed these changes, and they provided a glimmer of hope in her difficult days. However, Richard seemed to sense the kindness and intensified his cruelty towards her and other minority employees. One morning, Margaret, already burdened by stress and exhaustion, felt light-headed while pushing her cart. James, passing by, noticed her distress. Before she could respond to his concern, she collapsed. "Mrs. Johnson!" James shouted, dropping his papers and rushing to her side. He called for an ambulance as chaos erupted in the office. Richard emerged from his office, showing annoyance rather than concern. "What's all this commotion?" he demanded. Seeing Margaret on the floor, he scoffed. "Can't she even stay on her feet? We need younger, more capable staff." James, kneeling beside Margaret, was shocked at Richard's callousness. "Mr. Blackwell, she needs medical attention." But Richard dismissed it, saying, "Call an ambulance, but she's not coming back until she's fit. We're not a nursing home." As the paramedics took Margaret away, James was filled with anger. Despite his rage, fear of job loss kept him silent. Back at his desk, James was consumed by conflicting emotions. The office was abuzz with whispers about Margaret's collapse. Employees gathered in small groups, discussing the incident and Richard's cold-hearted reaction. Some worried about Margaret's well-being, while others were concerned about their own job security. James, being the one who first noticed Margaret's distress, was at the center of these discussions. But he was too lost in his guilt to contribute much, constantly replaying the bathroom incident in his mind and regretting his failure to act. In the days following Margaret's collapse, the office gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but a sense of unease lingered. James was constantly haunted by his inaction during the bathroom incident and Margaret's subsequent collapse. His guilt was so consuming that he found it difficult to focus on his work. Every time he passed by the supply closet where Margaret's unused cleaning cart was stored, a sharp pang of remorse shot through him. One evening, while burning the midnight oil to catch up on a backlog of reports he had neglected, James overheard a conversation in the break room that would change the course of events at Hartwell Industries. The hushed voices of Sarah from Human Resources and Tom from Marketing drifted towards him. "Did you hear the news?" Sarah asked. "The board just announced it. We're getting a new CEO." James's ears perked up, and he quietly moved closer to the break room door, straining to hear more. Really? What happened to Mr. Jennings? Tom replied. Retiring, apparently. The new guy's name is Harrison, Mr. Harrison. That's all I know for now. James's mind immediately started racing. A new CEO could potentially bring about significant changes to the company, and he dared to hope that this might be the long-awaited opportunity to address the toxic corporate culture that Richard Blackwell had fostered. However, years of witnessing Richard's unchecked power and influence made him skeptical. What if the new CEO was just like Richard, or even worse? The next morning, the office was abuzz with speculation about the new CEO. Rumors were flying in every direction. Some said Mr. Harrison was a strict cost cutter who would streamline the company, while others claimed he was a progressive reformer determined to shake things up. Richard Blackwell, on the other hand, entered the office in a foul mood. It was evident that he was not pleased with the change in leadership. All right, everyone, he barked. I know you're all excited about the new CEO, but we have work to do. This company doesn't run on gossip. Back to your desks. As the days passed, anticipation for Mr. Harrison's arrival grew. James found himself both hopeful and nervous. He kept imagining different scenarios of how the new CEO might transform the company. But he also knew that hope alone was not enough. Someone would have to take a stand against the existing problems. Finally, the morning of Mr. Harrison's first day dawned. James arrived at the office early, his stomach in knots. He half expected to see immediate signs of change, but everything seemed the same as always. As he settled into his desk, he overheard Richard talking loudly on a phone in his office. I don't care what his background is, Richard was saying, his voice dripping with disdain. This new CEO better not think he can come in here and change everything. I've worked too hard to build this department up to have some outsider tear it all down. James felt a shiver run down his spine. It was clear that Richard had no intention of changing his ways, regardless of who the new CEO was. The morning dragged on, and there was still no sign of Mr. Harrison. By lunchtime, the initial excitement had turned into confusion and more speculation. Where's the new CEO? Why hadn't he addressed the staff yet? It was mid-afternoon when James, on his way back from a coffee run, almost collided with a man he didn't recognize. The man was dressed casually in slacks and a polo shirt, a stark contrast to the formal suits that were the norm in the office. Oh, excuse me, James said, stepping aside. The man smiled warmly. No problem at all. Say, you wouldn't happen to know where I could find Richard Blackwell's office, would you? James nodded and pointed down the hallway. Last door on the right. Can't miss it. It's the biggest office on the floor. Thanks, the man said, then hesitated. I'm new here. Is there anything I should know about Mr. Blackwell before I meet him? James felt a moment of panic. Should he warn this newcomer about Richard's behavior? But what if this man was a friend of Richard's? Or worse, someone sent to test employee loyalty? Mr. Blackwell is very focused on results, James said carefully. He runs a tight ship. The man nodded thoughtfully. I see. Well, thank you for your help. James, he said, reading James's name tag. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. As the man walked away, James couldn't shake the feeling that he had just missed an important opportunity. He returned to his desk, berating himself for his cowardice once again. A few minutes later, a commotion from Richard's office drew everyone's attention. Richard's voice, raised in anger, could be clearly heard through the door. Who do you think you are? Richard was shouting. Coming in here dressed like that, asking questions. This is my department, and I won't have some low-level diversity hire telling me how to run things. The entire office fell silent, and all eyes were fixed on Richard's door. James felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had never seen Richard this angry before. Suddenly, the door swung open, and the man James had met earlier stepped out. His face was calm, but there was a steely glint in his eyes. Behind him, Richard appeared, his face red with anger. I believe, the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned office, that we need to have a company-wide meeting now. It was at that moment that James realized who this man must be. His suspicion was confirmed when the stranger continued. I'm Michael Harrison, your new CEO, and it seems we have some serious issues to address. The revelation sent shock waves through the office. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, some unable to suppress smiles at Richard's obvious discomfort. Richard himself looked as though he had been struck by lightning, all color draining from his face as the implications of his actions sank in. Mr. Harrison turned to address the room at large. "I'd like everyone to gather in the main conference room in 5 minutes. It's time we had an honest conversation about the culture of this company." As people hurried to comply, James felt a mix of emotions. There was relief that Richard's behavior might finally be exposed, anxiety about what this meant for the future of the company, and a growing sense of guilt that he hadn't spoken up sooner. In the conference room, employees filed in quietly, an air of nervous anticipation filling the space. Richard skulked in last, positioning himself near the back of the room, as far from Mr. Harrison as possible. Mr. Harrison stood at the front, his casual attire a stark contrast to the sea of suits before him. He waited until everyone was settled before speaking. "I had planned to spend my first day observing, getting a feel for how this company operates," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "What I've seen in just a few short hours has made it clear that we have some serious work to do." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I believe in creating a workplace where every employee, regardless of their position or background, is treated with respect and dignity. What I witnessed today falls far short of that standard." Richard shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. "I want to be clear," Mr. Harrison continued. "Discrimination, harassment, and abusive behavior of any kind will not be tolerated under my leadership. This company is about to undergo some significant changes, and I need every one of you to be on board." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked relieved, while others were worried. James found himself holding his breath, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "I know change can be difficult," Mr. Harrison acknowledged, "but I also know that it's necessary. Starting tomorrow, we'll be implementing new policies and procedures to ensure a safe and respectful work environment for all." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "I also want to extend an open invitation to anyone who has experienced or witnessed inappropriate behavior in this workplace. My door is always open, and I promise that your concerns will be heard and addressed." As the meeting concluded and people began to file out, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Mr. Harrison standing beside him. "James, isn't it?" Mr. Harrison said. "Could I have a word with you in private?" Nervously, James nodded and followed Mr. Harrison to a small meeting room. Once inside, Mr. Harrison's demeanor changed, becoming more approachable. "James, I couldn't help but notice your reaction when I was speaking about witnessing inappropriate behavior," he said gently. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" James hesitated. Years of ingrained fear battled with his desire to do the right thing. He thought of Margaret, of all the times he'd stayed silent, and made his decision. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "There is, and I think it's long overdue." In the small meeting room, James felt a mix of trepidation and relief as he faced Mr. Harrison. The weight of years of silence pressed heavily on his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, he began to unburden himself, recounting every detail of Richard's mistreatment of Margaret and other minority employees. He described the humiliating scenes in the bathroom, Richard's constant belittling remarks, and the overall toxic atmosphere that had pervaded the office under Richard's rule. Mr. Harrison listened intently, his expression growing graver with each word James spoke. He occasionally interjected with questions to clarify certain points, but for the most part, he let James tell his story without interruption. When James finished, he leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips. "Thank you, James," he said earnestly. "I know this couldn't have been easy for you, but you've done the right thing, and this information is crucial for us to move forward." True to his word, Mr. Harrison wasted no time in taking action. He immediately placed Richard Blackwell on administrative leave, pending a full and thorough investigation. The news spread like wildfire throughout the office, and while some employees were shocked, others secretly rejoiced. Richard's reign of terror seemed to be coming to an end. Simultaneously, Mr. Harrison initiated a comprehensive company-wide training program on diversity and inclusion. The program aimed to educate all employees about the importance of respect and equality in the workplace, and to root out any remaining vestiges of discrimination. Workshops, seminars, and group discussions were organized, and employees were encouraged to actively participate and share their experiences. But Mr. Harrison's most significant gesture came in the form of a visit to Margaret in the hospital. He insisted that James accompany him, believing that James's presence would bring Margaret some comfort. As they entered the small, sterile hospital room, James's heart ached at the sight of Margaret lying in the bed, looking frail and vulnerable. But when she saw them, a faint smile lit up her face. "Mrs. Johnson," Mr. Harrison said, taking a seat beside her bed. "I'm Michael Harrison, the new CEO of Hartwell Industries, and I believe you know James." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with curiosity. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Harrison," she said weakly. "James, it's good to see you." Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mrs. Johnson, I've come here today to offer you a sincere apology on behalf of the company. The way you've been treated is completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that we are committed to making things right. We are implementing a series of changes to ensure that this kind of mistreatment never happens again." He then went on to outline the various initiatives, including the investigation of Richard, the diversity training, and a review of all employees' working conditions and compensation. But it was his next words that truly touched Margaret's heart. "We would like to offer you an early retirement package, Mrs. Johnson," he said gently. "It comes with full benefits and a pension that will ensure you and your grandchildren are well taken care of. It's the least we can do to make amends for the pain and suffering you've endured." Margaret's eyes welled up with tears, and her hand trembled as she reached out to grasp Mr. Harrison's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." James, standing by the side, also felt a lump form in his throat. Seeing Margaret's reaction, he realized the magnitude of the change that was taking place. After leaving the hospital, Mr. Harrison turned to James with a proposition. "James, I've been very impressed with your integrity and your willingness to speak up. I believe you have the right qualities to lead our new employee relations department. We need someone who understands the challenges we've faced and has the courage to drive real change. How would you feel about taking on this role?" James was taken aback. He had never expected such an offer. "Me?" he stammered. "But I didn't speak up for so long. I let things go on when I should have said something." Mr. Harrison looked at him with a reassuring smile. "But when the crucial moment arrived, you did find the courage to speak out, James. That takes true strength. And now, you have the opportunity to use your experience to make a lasting difference in this company." James considered the offer carefully. He thought about Margaret, about the countless employees who had suffered in silence, and about the future of Hartwell Industries. Finally, he looked up at Mr. Harrison, his eyes shining with determination. "I'd be honored, Mr. Harrison," he said firmly. "I'll do my best to make sure that what happened to Margaret never happens to anyone else in this company." Mr. Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "Excellent, James. I have full confidence in you. We have a long and challenging road ahead, but I'm certain that together, we can transform Hartwell Industries into a model workplace." And with that, James embarked on a new journey, ready to take on his responsibilities and contribute to the positive change that was already underway at the company. Under the combined leadership of Mr. Harrison and James, Hartwell Industries underwent a remarkable transformation. Richard Blackwell, following a thorough investigation, was terminated from his position. The evidence against him, including James's testimony and accounts from numerous other employees, was overwhelming. His departure sent a clear message throughout the company that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. James wholeheartedly embraced his new role in the Employee Relations Department. He dedicated himself to implementing new policies, organizing training sessions, and most importantly, creating an environment where employees felt safe to voice their concerns. One of his first initiatives was to establish a mentorship program. This program paired newer employees with experienced staff members, aiming to foster a sense of community within the company and provide support for those just starting their careers. To everyone's delight, Margaret, even in retirement, agreed to serve as an advisor to the program, sharing her wealth of experience and wisdom. The changes at Hartwell Industries did not go unnoticed in the business world. As word spread of the company's commitment to fairness and equality, it began to attract top talent from diverse backgrounds. The influx of new ideas and perspectives led to increased innovation and productivity, and the company's bottom line began to reflect these positive changes. Employees who once felt fearful and resigned now seemed more engaged and optimistic. They smiled more, collaborated more freely, and truly seemed happy to come to work each day. One afternoon, about 6 months after Mr. Harrison had taken over as CEO, James received an unexpected visitor in his office. Margaret. She looked healthier and happier than he had seen her in a long time. "Mrs. Johnson," he exclaimed, rising to greet her with a warm smile. "It's so good to see you. How are you doing?" Margaret's eyes twinkled as she replied, "I'm doing wonderfully, James. Or should I say Mr. Anderson, head of employee relations." James chuckled. "Just James is fine, Mrs. Johnson. You've known me too long for formalities." Margaret then looked around his office, nodding approvingly. "You've done well for yourself, James. But more importantly, you've done well for others. I've been hearing about all the changes you've been making here." As they chatted, Margaret expressed her gratitude for the mentorship program. She said it had given her a new purpose in retirement. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mr. Harrison poked his head in and smiled when he saw Margaret. "I thought I recognized that voice," he said warmly. "Margaret, it's wonderful to see you. I hope you're not trying to lure James out of retirement to join you." Margaret laughed. "Not at all, Mr. Harrison. I was just telling James how impressed I am with all the changes around here. You've created something special." Mr. Harrison's expression softened. "We've all created this together. Every person who spoke up, every employee who embraced the changes, they're all part of this transformation, including you, Margaret. Your strength and dignity in the face of adversity inspired more people than you know." A few years later, James met Aisha, Margaret's granddaughter, who had started as an intern in the marketing department. Aisha shared with James that she had noticed some subtle biases in her department. James listened intently and took immediate action. He addressed the concerns with the marketing department heads, without revealing Aisha's identity, and outlined a plan for additional training and accountability measures. The company continued to grow and evolve. Hartwell Industries became known not only for its products, but also for its values. It received national recognition from the National Association for Workplace Equality for its outstanding commitment to diversity and inclusion. James was asked to accept the award on behalf of the company. As he stood on the stage, he thought of Margaret, Aisha, and all the employees who had contributed to this journey. He knew that the real reward was not the award itself, but the daily reality of a workplace where everyone felt valued and respected. James was committed to continuing this journey, to ensuring that Hartwell Industries remained a beacon of hope and change in the corporate world.
If this story touched you, show your support by liking and subscribing. Your encouragement helps us keep sharing memorable stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.